We've been dancing around the edges of Shakespeare's language for too long. I think it's time we got deep into the viscera of it. Titus Andronicus, where the figurative takes the literal in its teeth and shakes it till it breaks its back. In my first episode on Titus Andronicus, I was giving you social context. We were talking about the conditions that might have produced a play of this kind. In the second episode, I focused almost entirely on the plot, almost exclusively on the final scene, in order to really examine in depth the effect of the genre mashup that Shakespeare loved so much to do. I mean, it's very, very obvious in Titus, but it appears all throughout his plays. So that's where he takes the comedy and the tragedy and he makes them meld together to the point where, as an audience member, you're just experiencing an intense rush of emotions that are too enmeshed with one another to really pull them apart during the experience that you're having. Now, in that first video, I did promise that we would talk about character, and I will, but I might not be doing it in the way you might expect. When we analyse a more modern play for character, we're doing it within a framework of psychological realism that kind of took over in the late 19th century and came to dominate the stage for a very long time. In Shakespeare, character is built out of language. And in this play, the language is all centered on one particularly powerful image. It's not going to be news to anyone that Shakespeare loved his multiplicitous uses of figurative language. So situations where he will describe people, emotions, scenes, things, objects, transactions, as anything other than what they actually are, in order to create a more vivid picture in the audience of what it is they should be seeing when they look at the stage. What it's easy to miss, though, is how the themes of the play come out in the figurative language to a point where it becomes indistinguishable whether you're talking about an idea or the metaphor that is carrying it. Now, that all sounds a bit obscure, but Titus Andronicus is the most wonderful case study for us to pick apart how that works. Shakespeare often uses a technique where he creates what I call image clusters, where within the space of one play, a lot of the imagery, a lot of the figurative language will be centered on a particular group of ideas. So something like food or clothes or disease. In Titus Andronicus, everything is about the hunt. And I mean everything. The characters are hunted or hunting at any point in the play. Now take a moment to think about what the hunt meant to people in Shakespeare's time. They were not nearly so separated from their means of acquiring food as we are. So yes, at its most basic level, you would go hunting, you would bring home meat. So the difference between the hunt and other forms of acquiring meat is, of course, that it takes you out into the wild. You're trapping wild game rather than raising something domesticated. This puts the hunt into a very special space where it has to have a role in life that is far beyond the mere provision of sustenance. It becomes a sport, it becomes a game, it becomes a ritual. It starts at the very beginning when Titus sacrifices Tamara, the Goth queen's eldest son. Think about a sacrifice. A sacrifice is offering the gods food. So the first thing that we see in this play is someone feeding the gods with a person who has been captured and brought back to Rome in triumph. Triumph was a really particular thing where a victorious soldier would bring his captives in chains. So basically, much as you would come home with a prize deer that you have slain in the forest. And one of these captives is being offered up to the gods in the same way that a sacrifice is always a portion of what you intend to eat. Now, of course, the people who are actually at the pointy end of that equation are not going to appreciate that positioning and are going to do anything they can to reverse the situation. And so we go on to see during the time of an actual hunt, because the literal and the figurative are entirely intertwined in this play, we see Bassianus being treated as the lowest kind of prey. He is merely cut up and thrown into a pit. Lavinia is repeatedly characterized as a doe who was being pursued by hunters in the forest. What is truly extraordinary here is the level of detail it takes to make all these images interlink, to make it such that from the beginning to the very end of the play, every piece is somehow contributing to this filigree of imagery that is all tied back to ideas of the hunt. A lot of this is done through allusion. There's a great deal of classical allusion, particularly to stories of Ovid, and in particular, the story of Actaeon. Now, Actaeon was the poor sap who inadvertently saw Artemis and her women bathing and was cursed by her to turn into a stag and be torn apart by his own hounds. So he is the prototype for the hunter who becomes the prey and the sufferer of the fate of those that he sought to himself pursue. So he went out planning to hunt a deer, take it home and eat it, and instead he becomes the victim in that scenario. And so Tamara's two remaining sons are likened to creatures that hunt. They are something like wolves. They pursue prey in order to satiate their appetites. So we have an actual literal hunt going on that everyone is attending, but then we have various ways of pursuing and trapping prey within that. We have a pit where Bassianus's body is thrown and where two of Titus's sons are captured. We have a bag of gold placed under the tree, which is basically a kind of snare, a lure, a bait. We have Lavinia being set up as a doe to be pursued and then consumed. We have Tamara's ravenous, beastly sons. And then as the play goes on, we see this flipped. We find the people who were pursuers, who were hunters, who were wolves, become the prey, become the those that are sacrificed, become those who are eaten. In the final moments of the play, Aaron is sentenced to be buried up to his chest and famished. Tamara's body is sentenced to be thrown to the wild beasts and birds. So Aaron is starved, Tamara is food. And as people are made into animals, it causes us, of course, to reflect and question wherein lies our humanity. What is it that distinguishes us from these creatures, especially if we do things like consume and sacrifice and pursue and satiate appetites? Just look at the way, on my little matrix here, look at the way that Shakespeare manages to show all the things that the hunt is, and the way he does that is to make sure that all the characters in his play fulfill every single one of those functions. I suggest you take a look at my little diagram with the play in front of you and just circle in the play every time you see a person, a human, become the subject of any of those things in this matrix. Think about how uncomfortable this makes us, the audience, because of course humans, we prefer and expect to be the hunters. And here this play comes along and says, yes, but people can also be the prey. They can be the food, they can be the sacrifice, they can be the dismembered. So how does this relate back to character? Well, of course, there are plenty of points in this play where we can talk about psychological motivation, about things like loyalty, honor, family relationships, motivations for revenge. That's all there. But I think what is different and special about this kind of writing is the activation of this overall figurative net that says, well, what the characters are doing in this play is constantly battling, struggling with one another to get to be the hunter instead of the pursued, to be the one who hosts the banquet, like Titus at the beginning when he sacrifices Tamara's son, at the end when he serves her other sons up as pies. The struggle to be in that position and not be the eaten. There is absolutely no way I can show you all the instances of the hunt being referenced in this play because it is constant. So here's a tiny wee sample just so you can see the breadth that happens between points where an actual literal hunt is being talked about and described, and the way it reaches into points where characters use the language of the hunt to apply to human beings in order to convert them into the subjects of pursuit, prey, sacrifice, or consumption. So that's Titus Andronicus, where characters can be hunters and prey, where they have appetites or can be food, and where being served at a banquet is not always as appealing as it sounds.